Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to this special session of the film festival Urban Visions Beyond the Ideal City. I'm the curator of the festival, Luisa Bravo from City Space Architecture. I'm based in Bologna, Italy. I'm very glad to host this special session with the international speakers discussing about migration and humanitarian crisis. When we started this topic as part of the film festival on migrants, refugees, and displaced communities, we decided from the very beginning to approach this topic in a very sensitive way. We know that it is a very contested topic, which is also related to politics, but we do not want to enter into politics with our film festival. We just want to depict, describe, and investigate the human condition of migrants, refugees, and displaced communities by showing documents, audiovisual documents, and by informing, because there are a lot of preconceptions and misunderstandings regarding migrants and refugees. So in our competition dedicated to this specific topic, you can navigate from the website. You will see that we have selected from more than 350 proposals. We have selected about 30 we have shortlisted about 30 films that are describing the human condition of migrants facing poverty, war, living in bad condition, illegal, or trying to integrate into the European society. So the discussion around this topic is very complex, and we are trying to provide some content that could help defining in a better way how difficult, sometimes impossible, this condition of being a migrant and refugee could be. I would like to start this session by presenting you a film that we have out of competition. If you go in program here, special events, sorry, program out of competition, you have this film, Torn, by Alessandro Gassmann, that was also produced in cooperation with the High Commissioner for Refugees of the United Nations, and directed by Alessandro Gassmann, who is a very well-known and actor and director. He was traveling in Syria and across Jordan and Lebanon, and in this short documentary film, he's describing the condition of Syrian refugees, especially Syrian artists, displaced in Zaatari camp in Jordan and living in this multicultural Lebanese society. We are very happy to start the screening of all our urban visions dedicated with migrants, refugees, and displaced communities by introducing this documentary film, which was presented at Venice Cinema Biennale in 2015. That is a very important document to describe the sadness, loneliness, and the sense of solitude also of migrants displaced in a land that they cannot call home. Today, for the presentation of this complex topic, we have several speakers that will try to give an overview by defining this complexity from different countries. We have Wael Sinno from UN Habitat, Lebanon. UN Habitat is the United Nations Human Settlement Program, and he's leading the program in Beirut and Lebanon. We also have Husam al-Waer, who is a reader at the University of Dundee in Scotland. And we also have Kilian Kleinschmidt, which is an humanitarian expert with over 25 years in a wide range of countries, emergencies and refugee camps as United Nations official. And he is well known for his work at the Strappati camp, and in fact is well known as the mayor of Strappati. Welcome, Wael.
Hello. Thank you, Luisa, for organizing this special event.
Husam.
Hello, hello. Thanks for the invite as well.
And Kilian.
Hello everybody, and greetings from Tunis.
So it's very nice to have you here today, and I'm really glad that we managed to organize this roundtable discussion. As I said, I'm in Italy, and so I'm living the situation of migration, which is a real humanitarian emergency in Italy, especially for what's happening in the Mediterranean. So we are living this constant pressure related to migration that is coming from main news and from the political agenda. So we are so much accustomed to hear about these waves of migrants crossing the Mediterranean to reach the south of Europe and to reach Italy, and then willing to travel north and to reach some other countries in Europe, that we do not really pay attention to the real condition, human conditions of these migrants and refugees. So I'm happy to have you so that our audience can actually understand better from a completely different perspective by presenting case studies, experiences, and by putting your knowledge on this subject in the roundtable discussion later, that we hope to provide a new perspective on migration, which is a real humanitarian crisis. So I would like to invite now Wael to start his presentation.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. So again, Luisa, thank you for organizing this event and for inviting me to take part in it. And I'm really excited to actually talk about this very challenging topic, especially that we are really facing it in Lebanon. So again, I'm Wael Sinno, Area Coordinator for Beirut and Mount Lebanon at UN Habitat. So next, please, Luisa. So just to give you a general overview about Lebanon's context, Lebanon's population is estimated at 5.9 million, close to 90% urban, spread over an area of approximately 10,452 square kilometers. Lebanon hosts the highest number of displaced persons per capita in the world, 1 in every 4. So the lack of a national urban policy and pre-existing urban challenges has further increased inequalities and the lack of provision of and access to public services, especially for the different community groups such as refugees, migrants. So since 2006, UN Habitat has been focusing on responding to successive crises that the country has been enduring, which I will present in the next slides. Also, to implement its mandate, UN Habitat has partners with a wide range of local actors, such as national, subnational, local partners and authorities, and of course, civil society organizations. Next, please. So UN Habitat really promotes and urges municipalities and national and subnational authorities to develop and achieve adequate urban planning for all in order to lay the foundation of good urbanization. So UN Habitat has addressed reduced spatial inequality and poverty through successive projects across multiple sectors with a multi-sectoral area-based approach. So examples of our projects are the establishment of regional technical offices at the level of the municipalities and union of municipalities, where we provide them with necessary financial, human, and technical support to enable them to play a leading role in addressing the various urban needs of the host, refugee, and migrant communities. Also, we have several projects related to National Urban Policy Program that informs most of our interventions. We also have the city and neighborhood profiles, which I will present in a bit, urban upgrading projects, and most recently, COVID-19 and Beirut blast response projects. So UN Habitat's strategic plan provides a strong framework to address the country's challenges, which are mainly extensive urban challenges ranging from very poor to absence of urban planning, deteriorated public basic services not being updated since the Civil War, outdated municipality and city boundaries, complete absence of affordable housing, and non-existent public transportation system or public spaces. Next, please. So starting with the first crisis, which most of you know, which is the war in July 2006, where there was a complete or partial destruction of 35,000 housing units in southern Lebanon and complete destruction of 400 residential buildings in Beirut's southern suburbs. So the reconstruction process was massive and required enormous coordination. So in September 2007, UN Habitat initiated a housing reconstruction project that aims to support municipalities in southern Lebanon and managing and the overwhelming process, which was highly facilitated by the regional technical offices that I just mentioned, which accelerated the reconstruction process. So afterwards, UN Habitat and the Ministry of Interior and Municipalities implemented a project to promote strategic planning at the level of the Union of Municipalities, which identified several gaps within the planning frameworks in Lebanon and recommended the reform of urban planning systems. Next, please. Another crisis would be the Syrian refugee crisis in 2011, which manifested itself early on as an urban crisis where 80% of Syrian refugees live in urban settings in Lebanon, which were already struggling to meet the needs of the host community. So this rapid increase in the population size imposed enormous pressure on the housing sector and the already strained basic services such as water, electricity, the infrastructure networks. So UN Habitat was and continues to implement many projects that directly supports all communities, refugee, migrant, and host communities, while at the same time building the capacities of the municipalities to manage such crises. Next, please. So one of our most important projects is the neighborhood profiling, where UN Habitat produced city profiles and with UNICEF neighborhood profiles, which offer a springboard for moving towards sustainable urban development. So sadly, our latest population count was done during the French mandate. And with the complete absence of data on Lebanese, and believe it or not, we have better data on refugees than on the host community. So such initiatives are critical in laying the foundation for plan-led development. So neighborhood profiles are assessments on the living conditions of Lebanese and non-Lebanese residents of selected disadvantaged neighborhoods and the challenges that are being faced by these communities. We'll later have a short video regarding this project. And the data of the 28 profile disadvantaged neighborhoods are publicly available on a link that I will send later. So UN Habitat and UNICEF have been organizing capacity building workshops for municipalities and other local stakeholders who expressed the critical needs for such expertise, initiatives, and data. Next, please. So as mentioned earlier, we conducted 28 neighborhood profiles across Lebanon. The locations are marked in the white dots on the map. Next, please. So the neighbor profiles, we assess and analyze 13 sectors or themes for each neighborhood, which are mainly context, youth, governance, local economy, population buildings, safety and security, water, sanitation and hygiene, health, electricity, education, access and open spaces, and child protection. Next, please. So of course, we have a specific process that we adopt in order to conduct the neighbor profile in the area. So first we start by identifying the boundary of the neighborhood. Then we conduct field preparation, then data collection, then data processing, then analysis of the data and writing and visualization, then editing, validating maybe on field again, and then reviewing, and then disseminating to partners. So the most important aspect of this neighbor profile in this process is the tools that we use during the data collection. For example, during the field assessment, which mainly target the built environment, we use an online survey through an application, so we could link all the collected data on the buildings, streets, public spaces into our GIS platform in order to have everything georeferenced. Other data collection tools would be household surveys, key-informed interviews, and focus group discussions. Next, please. So here we see each sector, what is the source for the data collection. For example, for the context, we collect the data from field assessments and from literature review. For the safety and security, it's from field assessments, key-informed interviews, focus group discussions, and household survey. And you can see also the rest of the sectors. Next, please. So here we see an example of the findings of the neighbor profile. So at the end of, once we finalize the neighbor profile, we can have a population count of all the residents living in the neighborhood. And it is segregated by nationality and by age group, by gender. Next, please. Also, this is another example of the findings. For example, we can know the overcrowding, comparing it between Lebanese and non-Lebanese, and we can have a comparative findings between several neighborhoods that were being assessed. Next, please. Also, here we have, for example, the marriage before 15. We have the percentages of child marriage before 15 for Lebanese and non-Lebanese. Next, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the neighbor profile are available online on an online platform where you have access to an interactive map showing all sectors, color coding. It is a very clear assessment. So for example, here we can see that under local economy, we have 3 adjacent neighborhoods that were assessed in Burj Hamoud and Sinno municipalities. So you can see where we have shops, where we have workshops, where we have mixed use. You can have similar maps showing the building conditions. So for example, buildings with major damages, buildings with a minimal. So everything is color coding, and you can see all of it on an interactive map. Next, please. So moving to another crisis, which is a very sad one, which is the Beirut blast that happened on 4th of August. So directly after the blast, which caused 200 deaths, 6,000 injured, 300,000 persons affected, and almost 60,000 households that were impacted, UN Habitat responded immediately on the ground and continues to play a critical role in the recovery and reconstruction of the city. So directly after the blast, myself and several colleagues moved our office to municipality of Beirut and Burj Hamoud, which were the 2 most affected municipalities in Lebanon. We supported the municipalities in digitizing all their already existing maps into a GIS platform, and we helped them by collecting data on the level of damages for the buildings and the built environment. So we stayed there like for 1 month. Then we produced a rapid building level damage assessment that shows the level of damages. That was really helpful for all the partners who wanted to intervene in the area. We worked a lot on projects such as cash for rent assistance, shelter repairs, heritage buildings rehabilitation, reform, recovery, reconstruction, and still we are working on several projects now. Next, please. Also, we had the COVID-19 response, where exactly when the lockdown started, we had meetings with the Union of Municipalities to assess their needs, their gaps and challenges in the response to the COVID-19. We also designed, produced, and installed public hand washing stations across Beirut and Burj Hamoud areas. We also distributed hygiene kits to thousands of residents in Beirut and north of Lebanon. Next, please. So moving to more specifically projects targeting the different community groups such as the host, refugee, and migrants. So following the neighborhood profile findings for the profiled neighborhoods, numerous multi-sectoral gaps and challenges have been highlighted, like the lack of access to basic services, deteriorated built environment, lack of safety and security, deteriorated socioeconomic status of the residents, and lack of access to public spaces, which is leading to conflicts and tension between the residents because they're all suffering in their own, in the same own neighborhood. Hence, as a result, we introduced the idea of the urban upgrading projects that aim to improve the well-being of host and refugee population through enhanced environmental hygiene and social conditions. So the partners in these projects are definitely the municipalities, the relevant ministries such as Ministry of Energy and Water, Ministry of Interior and Municipalities, and international NGOs, and the beneficiaries are, of course, the host, refugee, and migrant communities. Next, please. So as a methodology, we already have profiled, as I said, several neighborhoods. However, we need to identify the boundary of the area of intervention, which will be the sub-neighborhood. We cannot do urban upgrading for a whole neighborhood. It needs a lot of fund. So our approach would be to do a pilot upgrading to have the municipality on board with us throughout the project as a capacity building for the municipality and other actors in order for them to replicate this intervention in other sub-neighborhoods in the neighborhood in order to have a bigger effect on the communities. So based on the neighborhood profile findings and the stakeholders' engagement, we identify a boundary for a sub-neighborhood for the project. Then through the neighborhood profile findings, additional field assessments if needed, and consultations with the stakeholders, we come up with the main critical needs, which were reflected by the communities, which supports us in developing an upgrading plan. And this upgrading plan can include activities related to shelter and buildings, basic urban services, public spaces, livelihood, social cohesion, and energy. Next, please. So as I mentioned, on the left, you see some findings of the neighborhood profile showing the built environment condition, for example, electricity, sidewalk, and others. And then afterwards, we move to a detailed assessment on field, which helps us to identify the boundary of the sub-neighborhood. Next, please. So as an example of the urban upgrading, we now have two urban upgrading projects, one composed of 1 street and 27 buildings, which is almost completed, and another one, a bigger project, which is composed of 5 alleyways and 89 buildings. So I'm gonna talk about the urban upgrading of the second project. So it has 3 main components, which are reflecting the needs of the communities during the stakeholders consultations. So the first component is the physical rehabilitation of the sub-neighborhood, which is mainly rehabilitation of the building's facade, building communal spaces, streets, implementation of greenery in the area, rehabilitation of private hazardous electrical wires, and other activities. Another component would be the capacity building and awareness raising for the communities. It includes cash for work, which I will talk about in a bit, awareness on hygiene and fire prevention interventions. And third component is the renewable energy. So next, please. So first component, which is the physical rehabilitation. So the buildings and streets rehabilitation will hopefully start soon. However, through Cash for Work, we selected community groups from different nationalities, gender, and age groups who were trained by the private service providers of the internet, satellite, and generator on how to rehabilitate the private electrical wires. So we had like a 2 days training. Then they completed the works in a very successful way in like 2 months, where they rehabilitated the whole electrical wires for the 5 alleyways. The municipality was super impressed by this intervention, and now they want to adopt the same methodology to replicate this intervention in the whole area, because the Burj Hamoud area is really suffering from the hazardous electrical wires. Next, please. So, second component, which where we ensured the involvement of the community members in the implementation of the activities of the project through cash for work. So, as I mentioned, the rehabilitation of the electrical wires, production of tote bags, as you see on the photo top left, tote bags and masks, implementation of greenery in the neighborhoods, and rehabilitation of the Civil Defense Center. All of these were completed by the community groups in the area. So I think this is a very important initiative, because through the cash for work, we are improving the socioeconomic status of the residents. We are capacitating them with a new skill which helps them to find a job in the near future, hopefully. It ensures social cohesion between all these community groups to exchange their experience. And most importantly, it increases the sense of ownership of these communities towards their neighborhood. Next, please. So, yeah, the third component of the project is the renewable energy system that was installed on the roof of a public building to feed the solar street lighting in the alleyways. Next, please. The most important aspect of the project is the local committee. So in the first phases of the project, where we are identifying the boundary of the sub-neighborhood, once the boundary is identified, we start identifying active key stakeholders, of course, from different backgrounds, nationalities, age groups, and gender, to take part of the local committee, because this project is a community-led project. So they are the decision maker in this project. And of course, we ensure the involvement of the marginalized community groups. We draft together a TOR that describes the roles and responsibilities of this committee. And they help us a lot throughout the projects, because they stay on board with us all along the project when it comes to decision-making, mobilizing the community, giving them news about when we are going to start with the work. So they are still on board with us, and we are really in good relation with them. Next, please. This is an example of the completed, this is the before status of the sub-neighborhood. So here you see the hazardous electrical wires with the water pipes, the deteriorated condition of the buildings and the streets. Next, please. So here you see the transformation, which is all based on the local committee decision and choice, and the aspirations, colors of the buildings, the basalt on the streets. So we tried here to enhance the accessibility, the conditions of the sub-neighborhood, which in turn enhances the well-being of the communities, and hence leads to social cohesion between all the community groups. Next, please. This is another photo. Yes, and for the transformation. Next, please. So similarly to the establishment of the Regional Technical Office, this project is mainly about the establishment of a municipal social cell to mitigate the social and protection issues resulting from urban migration through enhanced targeting and active engagement of the municipality of Beirut. Next, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, Beirut is the main economic hub of the country. And in 1948, due to the Israeli-Arab crisis, thousands of Palestinians were settled in Beirut. Also in 2011, Beirut received around 50,000 Syrian refugees with the war in Syria. So the social safety and security conditions have worsened in the poor neighborhoods hosting those population groups, and requires direct and active involvement of the municipality of Beirut. However, due to the lack of the human resources at the municipality and the lack of access to reliable information and data, and due to the involvement of the municipality of Beirut in addressing these social protection issues, which was very minimal, and the communities are really suffering from social protection issues. And this is why we established a municipal social cell composed of 2 social workers and 1 community mobilizer to establish this trust between the municipality and the communities in these vulnerable neighborhoods, specifically the refugee and migrant populations. Next, please. So as I mentioned, the target groups are the vulnerable populations, the municipal staff, local NGOs, organizations in the area, and of course, community representatives and focal points. Next, please. So the project has three main outputs. The first one is reinforced municipal capacity to manage and address urban migration issues through the establishment of the cell. Second one is the enhanced municipal capacity for social targeting through improved access to reliable social and protection data. And the third one is increased level of vulnerable groups' well-being through increased municipal social interventions. Here we mean the projects. So as activities, we launched CEL in the beginning of March 2021. We conducted capacity building trainings for the CEL, for the staff. The staff did a comparative study between all the neighborhoods that were profiled in Beirut, and we selected two as pilot projects for this CEL. Then we are now in the process of identifying the key focal persons who will be on board with us in this project, who will represent the community. So as an imagination, we have this municipal social cell representing the municipality. We have the focal persons representing the communities. And these two entities will work closely together to identify the key challenges and gaps that the communities are suffering from in order to come up with priority interventions, which will be implemented by the municipality. So we are hoping that this will actually establish this relation between the municipality of Beirut and these communities, which is really highly needed in this context. Next, please. So as expected results, we are aiming that this action will raise municipal awareness on urban migration issues. Again, it will create this link and trust between the municipality and the vulnerable populations. And it will identify priorities for municipalities and NGOs for further decisions on implementation. The expected impact is enhanced well-being and improved safety conditions, empowered local authorities for better managed interventions, strengthened municipal involvement in addressing urban migration issues, and enhanced access to reliable social protection data. And on a local level, these priority interventions, which will be identified by the cell, will be during or beyond the action implemented by municipalities or other donors. Next, please. So here we see some introductory meetings where the cell introduced the project for the head of Mukhtar, the key stakeholder in the area. Then they had separate key informed interviews with each Mukhtar in order to check his or her point of view on the situation in the neighborhood, which will help them more understand the context and move forward with a kickoff meeting with the key stakeholders on field and go on with the project. Next, please. The last project that I will be presenting is the mobile health clinic, where the municipality of Beirut, funded by MMC and UN Habitat, will be operating a mobile health clinic, which will provide free and non-discriminatory COVID-19 testing and other basic medical services to any individual who is unable to access these services currently, which is mainly most of the residents in this vulnerable context. Next, please. So now we're at the stage where we are procuring and retrofitting the mobile health clinic. Then afterwards, we'll be training the project staff who will be working in the health clinic. Then with support from the municipal social cell, we'll be working on communications development. Then, of course, awareness raising campaigns for the residents to promote the mobile health clinic that this mobile health clinic will be serving them. And then we'll be operating this clinic. And then we are hoping at later stages for this health clinic to provide vaccines for the communities. Next, please. So as outcomes, first outcome is that migrants of this project is that migrants, refugees, and marginalized Lebanese residents are protected from and treated from COVID-19. Here we are aiming to do PCR tests for the communities who are not able to and cannot afford the test in order to have a decrease in the positivity rate of COVID-19 in the area. The second outcome would be migrant refugees and marginalized Lebanese residents have equitable access to healthcare services in the area. So it doesn't specifically work on COVID-19, but also want the communities to have access to health services throughout this mobile health clinic. So that's it from my side. Happy to answer any questions that might arise. Thank you so much, Luisa.
Thank you, Wael, for this very informative presentation about your efforts in Beirut and Lebanon. I know Beirut because I've been living in Beirut for some time, some years ago, and so I know how difficult the situation can be, especially now because of the explosion that happened at the port of Beirut last year and because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was already difficult because of the presence of so many migrants and refugees that now I understand also from so many projects that you are presenting that the situation is even worse, I guess. So really, it's a huge effort that you are promoting as area coordinator in Beirut and Mount Lebanon. So, but what is the reaction? So, what kind of engagement you are able to promote through this project? Is there a real commitment? I see. So.
Yeah, so as you saw, thank you so much, Luisa, for your feedback. So as you saw that UN Habitat work doesn't mainly target one community. We always target the whole communities throughout our projects. So we don't specifically like come and say we want to support migrants or refugees or host community. We want to enhance the spatial condition that the communities are living in, because once we do that, this will improve the well-being, which will in turn enhance the social cohesion between the residents. And personally, I believe that this is something beautiful to have people from several backgrounds and nationalities to live together, because this will create a very healthy environment. There will be an exchange of cultures, of traditions, where a lot of innovative things can come up through this thing. However, as you mentioned, sometimes the context doesn't help at all. And specifically in Lebanon, since 2019, since the uprising, we've been having several challenges and crises. Like, for example, we had the uprising, as I said, we have absence of government, we have the inflation in our currency, which reached now 500%. And before that, we didn't even have access to basic services. So imagine with all these challenges, and now we have the access to the basic services is even more limited. So even with the whole work that we are doing now, we can see the conflict and challenges between the people. So it is very challenging. That's why we always promote the projects that throughout our projects, we always work with the whole communities. And also we work with the municipalities and providing access to the basic services, because once we do that, this will really reduce the tension between the communities. Because like there's a lot of pressure on these now, and all of the people are suffering. So yes, the context is very challenging. There are a lot of mitigation measures that can be applied, like working with the municipalities or the coordination between all the humanitarian agencies together on how to approach the people. Because once a partner comes to an area for an intervention, this organization should do first a stakeholders mapping of which organization are working on what, to have like one approach on how to approach the communities. Because I work on field as well, and I see a lot of complaints from the communities that you are supporting the refugees, not the host, and vice versa. So we really need to work on how to approach the communities. It really makes a difference. This is based on my experience on the field.
Yes, yes.
So yeah, it is very challenging, and we are hoping that throughout our projects, and honestly, I can see the difference. And I can see it from from the municipalities' feedback, from the beneficiaries' feedback, and we are always working towards this. Our main aim is the social cohesion between the communities.
Yes, so very, very clear, and thank you for sharing so many initiatives, which I think are well framing what we are trying to present here. So the human condition and the human support that UN Habitat, that every single person, like you or all those who are engaged in these projects and initiatives, are giving to the community at large. Because as you said, it's not just about migrants, refugees, it's the community itself that is supported by all these projects.
Exactly.
Okay, so thank you, Wael. We will have time later to discuss more during the roundtable discussion. Now I would like to invite Husam Al-Waer to take the floor. Hello, Husam.
Hello. Now I'm trying to. Can you see my slide? Yeah.
Not yet.
And now? Not yet. Let me try again. Just 1 second then.
Yes, now I see your slides. Okay,
you
can
see
put your slides on.
Yeah, okay. Here we go. Can you see the slide?
Yes.
And you hear me well, yes?
Yes, I hear you well. As I said, Husam is a reader at the University of Dundee in Scotland, and he's also a well-known academic scholar and on architecture, urban planning, and sustainability. He also writes extensively and speaks in many different venues about making better places. Husam is originally from Syria and now living in the UK. So I think you are, as I'm seeing now the picture of your presentation here as a cover image, you will be presenting your research, analysis, and studies on Zaatari camp in Jordan, which is the largest camp, correct me if I'm wrong, in Jordan, which is hosting Syrian refugees.
Okay, thanks very much, Luisa, for the introduction. So I am going to move to a slightly different context from the first presenter. So I will move into one of the, exactly as Luisa said, it's one of the largest Syrian refugees camp. Actually, at some point, even it was regarded the largest one in the world, actually, with which reached at some point more than 120,000 people at some point. And now it has about 80,000 inhabitants so far. I am going to explain something might be of interest, actually, because there are a lot of good lessons to be learned from Al-Zaatari, specifically Al-Zaatari, especially when it's come to the relationship between the top-down approach proposed or imposed by the United Nations and the bottom-up, which was, how can I say, created in a creative way, in a collective way by the inhabitants itself over the last 6 or 7 years. So I will say something about the transformation process and the relationship between the two different approaches, and also the differences between the two as well. I would like to start quickly with this quote by the famous Jane Jacobs, when she said cities have the capability of providing something for everybody, only because and only when they are created by everybody. And this is why I was so delighted with the approach from the previous presenter, which is, to me, even camps itself is at the heart of it. And I will explain how this statement being really applied in the camps itself. Let me start with some international agenda, if you allow me. Imagine even the statistics in front of you, although this is 3 years old, imagine this is now out of date. So far, worldwide, there are more than 70 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. That's, by the way, 70 million. That's the population of France. So imagine the population of France is representing the displaced people worldwide. About 10 million of them, or more than 10 million, are stateless, or about 25 million of them are refugees. Interestingly, 55% of those people, unfortunately, came from 3 countries: Syria, Afghanistan, and South Sudan. Now, I'm not expecting you to read all the statistics. I will just be quick on some of the key snapshots. And now imagine every minute 24 people worldwide are displaced. So my goodness, since we start this event, how many people are so far displaced? 1 in every 113 people on Earth is an asylum seeker, internally displaced, or a refugee. One thing to bear in mind, I think this maybe resonate what my previous presenter present. Refugees at the end of the day are a human being. So even war or crisis or conflict doesn't erase humanity, culture, pride, or even hope. In fact, even I am proud of the Scottish government. In Scotland, we have around 5,000 refugees now from Syria. We don't call them refugees. We are not allowed to call them refugees. We call them future Scots. In Syria itself, Syria special case in the sense you have more than 3.5 million refugees in Turkey, around 1 million, actually 1,100,000. Those, by the way, only registered in Lebanon. So wow, as my colleague said, 1 out of 4 inhabitants in Lebanon are refugees. And I agree with him. That's create a huge tensions at all levels in terms of equity, in terms of sources, resources, access to facilities, services, blah, blah, blah. Plus, remember, Lebanon is a poor country and with a lot of issues and challenges. You have 250,000 in Iraq, 650,000 in Jordan, but even inside Syria itself, you have more than 6 million internally displaced. In fact, in Idlib itself, which is the north governance in Syria, it has about 4 million refugees on its own. So interestingly, there is a huge issues externally and internally in a country like Syria. Now, I would like to talk about the camps. Camps can be considered as a space of paradox because it's placed the refugees in a space that neither belongs nor is wanted by the host nation. So that's the biggest, this is why we call it space of paradox. However, I will show you later on when the camp can be regarded as urban spaces, how it could enable the refugees themselves to claim ownership over their own geography and the ability to change the injustice and the inequality acting against them. Now, with a humanitarian approach, and I'm not against a humanitarian approach, we need it. But the problem with a humanitarian approach, it is always associated with a phrase called temporality. So it is being temporary. When I say temporary, that means, oh, this may last a month, 2 months, 3 months. But a lot of research in practice and academia show, no, this is not true. Most of those camps last for years, and some of them, they become indefinite camp. And this is the case in all Palestinian refugees camp in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt. They become, how can I say, eventually uncontrolled cities. However, when it's come to Al-Zatari, and that's what make me excited about Al-Zatari, as you can see from this image itself, very uniform, very top-down, because how you can see it's just about units, about caravans. But over time, oh my goodness, if you look at the pictures on the right-hand side, that's what make me interested. Oh my goodness, yes, it looks awful in terms of what's happened to the infrastructure and spaces between the units. But look, what on earth happened to the caravans itself? Where those hybrid structures come from? And all are fitted with satellites, with water tanks, and so on. So this is another interesting image for it. And that's what Al-Zatari. So you don't see any more the caravans per se. You see a very, how can I say, informal structures, looks a bit organic, and it really reminds us to a large extent with some of the structures of Islamic cities and so forth. That's why the way the streets in the middle is the main high commercial streets of Al-Kham itself, which has got so far now more than 3,000 productive shops. which become the economic engine of Al-Zatari camp. If you go in the Google Earth as well, you will see how the camp start very rigid rows based on the regulations of United Nations. And my goodness, over only a year, the whole structure being diffused, and you see that different typologies start emerging. So this is why I really become excited about it. I only put those 2-3 slides about Lebanon just on the back of the last presentation. And I need to mention this is quite important. In Lebanon, the way the Lebanese government they respond differently. In Lebanon, there is no camp policy. They stated very clearly, there will be no camp policy. What they said, they distributed 1 million refugees, more or less, on kind of series of clusters, as you can see in the red dots. Now, you might tell me why. There was a fear if we start establishing camps for Syrian refugees, the refugees might convert those camps eventually into cities, like the Palestinian camps. So there was a fear from the Lebanese government that, oops, we don't want to have that case. And this is some of the pictures of the informal tent settlements in Lebanon. But now, the reason for it, why you might tell me why Lebanese government was afraid. If you look at these pictures, the one on the top, it is the camp of Baqa in Amman, 1978, after the war between Israel and the Arab countries. If you look at the pictures underneath, this is become by now is really just informal city. It is a city on its right. Now, I will show you later on how the Jordanian government dealt with Al-Zatari. On one hand, they allow, how can I say, allow United Nations to establish a camp, but I will show you how they control the structure and the infrastructure of it. So this is Al-Zatari camp, my friend. It's only 8 kilometers to the south of the Syrian border. And as you can see, it's a bit close from Amman as well. Very important to remember, to bear in mind something, that 90% of those people who live in the camp came from a city called Daraa. Daraa is a very south city, very close to the Jordanian border. The camp, some statistics for your attention. So far, it has 80,000. I doubt it has 80,000. For political reason, they said it is 80,000, but I'm not going to share this with you right now, why it is not 80,000. It has 55% are under 24. Interestingly, 20% are under 5 years old. Average of 50 bears per week. So imagine the camp produce about 80 babies a week and more. Why? Just because of the young marriage and so on. Unfortunately, the camp itself cover only 5.3 kilometers square. That's very dense, by the way. There is a lot of even lessons to learn from density and how they treat density. So it is split 50-50 between male and female. As I said to you, about 85% of the population come from one city. And that's, by the way, help. Why it helped? Because those who come from those cities, more or less, they know each other and they have a lot in common when it's come to tradition and so on. There are so far in the camp about 24,000 prefabricated caravans. And I will explain where the caravans come from. But as you can see, the camp is really a city on its own. Why? It has around 12 schools, 27 community centers, providing different kinds of psychological supports and so on, 2 hospitals with 55 beds and 9 health cares and 1 delivery unit. The pictures, the site at the back of this big slide show the camp itself. It is, as you can see, it is like a prison. It is isolated. It is fenced. Jordanians are not allowed to communicate with Syrian refugees. So it is gated community, let us put it this way. Al-Zatari came from a village in front of the pictures, very close to it, called Al-Zatari. It is a Jordanian village. This is the plan, the master plan of the camp. To be fair with the United Nations and the mayor, Kilian, who you will hear from later on. One thing I like and people like about it, how they split the camp into a 12 district with a very nice design code. So each district has a specific specific, how can I say, facilities, services. Even they assign clearly how many people should live in that district, the streets, and how many household in each tent or caravan. This is a quick section show just how the camp opened in 2012, and wow, within just a year it became more or less a city, as you can see. So it started from nothing, and if you look at the section, it's really become a city on its right. I need to highlight something very important. The Jordanian government didn't allow whatsoever vertical structures. So you don't see first floor or second floor. So everything's just vertical. Hence, they introduce the caravan. Why? Because the caravan has got no infrastructures underneath, has got no foundations. So even foundation is not allowed to be structures in the camp. Why? They do not want to establish anything may lead to permanent structure or permanent solutions. So they tried to control the camp and leave it in what I call it temporary status. This is the density in the camp. As you can see, it is more or less, let me go back to this. As you can see, that's T shape. If you look at number 1, that's more or less the main gate, and the T shape, they distributed all the key facilities and services around the T shape. Why? So they make it easy for maintenance, access of facilities, services, and distributions of food, water, and so on. But more importantly, the control. Because remember, when those refugees came to the camp, they came with a lot of problems, including tensions between themselves, and even United Nations worker. This is no longer the case after they built a trust with the refugees. So this is just showing the density, how dense it is, especially around key facilities and services. As I said, there is now around 80,000 inhabitants in the camp itself, covering 5.2 kilometers. This figure is very key in the sense, this is the Maslow hierarchy of needs when it's come to health and well-being. For United Nations, and again, I don't want to be negative about United Nations, no. When you are dealing with emergency, the first 2 priorities for United Nations is 2 things. The importance of psychological needs, providing psychological needs in terms of food, water, rest, blah, 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 and safety, security and safety. That's what I call it, basic needs. Okay? And of course, being clean and so on. So the only problem with that, we need to recognize refugees are not a homogeneous mass, but they comprised of individuals with different levels of knowledge and different needs and expectations. Unfortunately, this is not being recognized when it's come to how to deal with emergency. I remember in one day, the Al-Zatari camp received 10,000 people in one day. That's a huge to deal with. This is how United Nations deal with camp and camp design and plan. It's very top-down. It is really mainly to deal with humanitarian aid. It's very rigid, focus on targets and units and how to set up them so quickly. So it is, yes, you could say it is one fit size approach. So for example, for a family, which should comprise 5, You give them only one tent or caravan with one latrine. For community, 80 tents, one water tap, and 2 refuse drums. For block, 1,000 to 250. For sector, 5,000, and so on. This is how they dealt in a way or another with Al-Za'atari camp. So I could say it's so top-down. It's really to do with the end state numbers. More or less, it is to do with as well command and control. A bit I found it complex. So this is how they deal with it. However, Professor David Sanderson said, give refugees better conditions, and there will be less international pressure to get them back home. No wonder why the Jordanian government, Lebanese government, and other governments, they have that fear from creating and establishing, or even, how can I say, improving the living conditions. Because it shows, a lot of research shows, the soon you improve the conditions, there will be less pressure for these people to go back. So as you can see, such approach top-down, it creates institutional boundaries. It creates even spatial boundaries, but even cultural boundaries. Now, I am going to move on to the second approach, which is the bottom-up. Of course, by the way, guys, I am not against the top-down. Why? The top-down has got the resources, has got the money, has got the power, and we need them, especially at the early emergency stage. Now, I will show you now over time, when those people, when I say those people, the inhabitants realize, oh my goodness, this is not about just the next 2-3 days. It seems to me we're going to stay here for longer. I will show you how the refugees transform the camp itself. I would like to start with those two strong statements. As soon as the camps last beyond the emergency phase, they transform into spaces with which people began to identify. I call that the permanent paradox, a life of refugees in camps where between an indefinite temporality, a space that is transformed because its occupants necessarily appropriated in order to live in it. What the refugees done, the soon they have the basic needs in terms of psychology and safety, they start really moving into how to promote and improve the psychological needs, i.e., for example, establishing relationship, friends, prestige, feeling of accomplishment, but also really start some of them moving to self-fulfillment needs, i.e., achieving potential, even including creative activities and economy, which I will show later on through evidence, because I am very evidence-based person. 3 things I realized over the last 6 or 7 years in refugees in Al-Za'atari. How they use placemaking as an act of collectivism, where camp inhabitants see to help each other as a partners in adversity. And I will show you some example. The soon the refugees start feeling comfortable in a way or another with the place itself, especially when it's come to basic needs and moving beyond basic needs, they start establishing this kind of relationship between United Nations and the mayor's office and the people on the ground. And that's a start really leading to hybrid environment. So refugees start establishing this kind of negotiation on daily basis, which really led to dynamic social relationship. As you can see, they start really helping each other with how they transform the camp. Such a transformation they start with, by the way, tents. Tents has a lot of issues because some of them capture fires. A lot of refugees lost of their lives. The camp itself is located in desert, so that the tent was created hostile environments when it's come to how to deal with heat and cold at night. Then United Nations introduced the idea of caravans, which cost around each caravan cost around $3,000, donated by Japan, Korea, and some of the Gulf states. It's only 15 meters square, by the way. What I found it interesting, how the refugees start merging the caravan with the tents in order to create more hybrid space and create more spaces. And over time, as you can see, they establish more spaces. The more they feel comfortable, they more accommodate more spaces. And you might tell me where this corrugated stuff coming from, where those corrugated and materials come from. Over time, the refugees start smuggling illegally those materials. You might tell me where they from. They start establishing a good relationship with the trucks drivers who serve the camp on daily basis. So as you can see, those sheets, the metallic sheets, come illegally to the camp. Interestingly, those to do with the environmental. You might tell me why they cover the caravan with such sheets, just to create an insulations so they protect themselves from the heat. Even the refugees themselves, the caravan itself, they've been very lucky with the caravan. They create flexibility to them in terms of the caravan. They created caravan conveyor and they start moving the caravans around. You might tell me what for. Those who are from the same families, they start establishing clusters of caravans, so they start living beside each other. Those who were neighbor back in Daraa and they trust each other, they start really live beside each other. This is just some of the drawings and research showing how they move the caravans around. So interestingly, see how the more they feel comfortable, they start merging things and create different kind of spaces. Even they start creating courtyard, and some of those courtyard were with shelters as well. Not only that, the transformation, even they created their main high streets, which become their main living. It become their main living, extending living room. And by the way, I think you may laugh at this. The high street itself called Champs-Élysées. Champs-Élysées, and I will say it a little bit later on. See what I like. One of the scholar, his name is Ayham. He managed to draw all the housing typologies created by the refugees. I am conscious of the time. I don't have a lot to time to create it, to explain it. The second one, how placemaking was used as a psychotherapy, which was an attempt to lessen an anxiety by really reproducing the familiar. This is, by the way, this photo is by an interesting Italian artist. She went to the camp. I think Luisa knows the artist quite well, so do I. She managed to map now in Al-Zatari camp, there are around 63 fountains, 63 water fountains, and this is one of them. And what I found it interestingly, how they dealt with the environmental issues, how they managed to insulate the roof itself by creating innovative solar shading, which is, it is really all to do with, how can I say, producing the familiar. Even if you look at some of the internal decorations, you see such internal decorations in Daraa, in the rural housing areas, or even some small balcony. But see what I like, starting from basic environmental response to more complex, how they start even clustering themselves around a courtyard with different types of spaces. So see, one thing I like about the bottom-up approach, it create really a simple rules. It was emergent solutions. So basically, they adapted the spaces and the spaces between buildings to suit their needs, but also it was all to do with collaboration. So it was to do with self-organized through collaborations. So interestingly, see how they brought those, the bottom-up brought such agenda. I really love these photos, again, by the same Italian artist. It really reminds me with the old cities in Beirut, old cities in Damascus, Aleppo. This kind of, see, narrow aisleways, courtyards, and spaces between buildings. But look at the decoration itself. Really very, very similar to what we produce, even what we do in rural areas in Syria. I really love these pictures. This is for a very famous salon Ahmad for brides. She, by the way, sometimes does, how can I say, makeup for about 18 grooms a day. She painted her main door just to distinguish herself. What I like about the Syrian refugees, they start producing and establishing color coding just to distinguish themselves. This is another chap, he's a leader. By the way, each district now in the camp has got a leader, a mukhtar. That mukhtar act as a mediator between United Nations and those who are responsible for the camp and local communities in order to mediate the needs and demands and any issues or challenges. In order to distinguish himself, he created this arch, because this is the house of the mukhtar, the leader. Doesn't matter if it is complete or not, just to give it a status. Economy was really key on the camp. So the camp, the inhabitants to start with, at the emergency state, they rely heavily on the donations and the aids from United Nations. But over time, wow, Syrian refugees start establishing businesses. So the T shape you see, that's become the high street. The one in the middle, the long one, is really a Champs-Élysées. It came from the French name Champs-Élysées. Why? Because there is a huge hospitals owned by French authority. Sham came from Board Syria. This is, you see, all the economic activities, the color coding, mobile phones, restaurants, fruits. I even came to know there is Syrian refugees managed to buy 2 or 3 caravans, and he opened a swimming pool there. So imagine, look at how vibrant the streets. This is the high streets, the Champs-Élysées. It really generates a lot of economic activities. Imagine the caravans the value of the caravans, the actual values was 0. Some of those caravans now being sold in like from 1,000 up to 10,000 pound or euro. Just imagine the rent of some of those caravans now is around 1,000 euro a month. So just to show you as well how value being captured. The bicycles you see, those donated by Amsterdam local authorities. They encourage refugees to use cycling as well during the camp. Now, the problem with this, I want to highlight this. Placemaking now become a competition where those with the power, those who's got resources, acquire more at the expense of those who do not. So interestingly, inequality emerged in the camp. So those who managed to establish resources, or they managed to bring their money from Daraa, they establish businesses and their life has improved because they start renting or buying more caravan. But those who didn't really, how can I say, they still rely on the United Nations aids. So just I'm showing you some pictures. This is, for example, a salon as well so women could rent clothes as well for wedding. This is another one, kunafa. It starts with 2 people. Now they have 6 or 7 people working on it, and they sell this kunafa now back in Amman. Just I want to say now, the camp itself become a free zone. Why? A lot of the stuff being made in the camp being sold in a cheaper price in Amman. So yes, the camp become a free zone as well. I would like to say something, since we talk about arts, something break my heart. Whenever you go in the camp, you see a lot of drawing like this. My goodness, I forget what they call it. A drawing like this, it's all about we must go back to our home and homeland, and it is all about education. please look after our children and their education. Their education is important, is important, is important. So as you can see, wherever you go, you saw these drawings. So just to recap the conclusion, I am not against the top-down. As I said to you, we need them because they have the power, they have the resources, they have the money. But as Jane Jacobs, how do we organize complexity? Organized complexity comes when the top-down meet the bottom-up. We need the two together. We need the two ways together, and we need to mediate the two together. And this is what I like about the role of Kilian and his colleagues, how they mediate the top-down and the bottom-up. Because when you do so, you enable behaviors. You have a more communicative space, and you create collective culture as well. So this is my conclusion in front of you, and I will leave it up.
Thank you very much, Husam. Your session was really very informative, and I'm reading messages from our audience that I can later watch again this video. So just to let you know, we are recording this session that will be later available on the YouTube channel of City Space Architecture. But thank you again, Husam, because I think you actually explained very well regarding the complexity that also Wael in his previous presentation was addressing. So in this camp, the need to redefine space and to reconsider daily life, not just for emergency, but for human daily needs, and recreating those familiar spaces that are from the urban form of ancient settlements in those areas. It is a way for these refugees to define this camp as a home, and
exactly.
to feel less lonely, less desperate, by establishing also these bonds with others, and through placemaking also fostering social cohesion. I think you explained really very well about the process.
I have to tell you, there is another camp in Jordan, but the Jordanian authority didn't allow the refugees to transform it. And I know Kilian has it wasn't easy for Kilian to manage that. So I have to tell you, this is why I need to be very careful. Yes, the refugees managed to transform it, but that's because the authority allowed this as well.
Yes. So it's interesting now to call Kilian in this conversation, since as I was presenting you, I was mentioning your role in the Strappati camp as the mayor. So apparently you were the one working on the top-down approach that Husam was describing, if I'm not wrong.
You muted, Kilian.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for these presentations. And of course, there's a direct link between what Husam just presented and the work I've been doing. Yes, I've been with the United Nations till 2014. It was actually in Zaatari that I decided to quit. I'm since then independent advisor to various governments, sometimes also the private sector. And I work now here in Tunisia. And I will come to this a little later on, actually, a migration program which has two components. And I think it's of interest to the audience as well to talk about migration from this perspective in Northern Africa. But I will also talk about the dimension of migration and people on the move in general, globally, because I think it's important to put this into perspective. Let me, however, start just linking up to the al-Zaatari experience. Yes, I was put there as the camp manager and basically as the top-down decider of what and how should be provided as services to the refugees. I was not the one who set up the camp. I was the one who was put in because the camp had gone out of control. Because there was a dimension which we have been missing at the time as UNHCR, as the humanitarian community. It's not only about standards. It's not only about fulfilling the basic requirements of a human being to eat, drink, go to the toilet, cook, and have shelter. This is about more. These are human beings who perceive this, as Husam calls it, the top-down approach as in fact a form of dictatorship. They called me sometimes you're like Assad, because we decided over their well-being. And then and there I tend to disagree with Husam. It was not the Jordanian government which allowed to have the camp of al-Zaatari transform into a living space. It was the people who enforced that. It was the people who first enforced that. Anytime the Jordanian authorities wanted to prevent them of doing something, they basically were throwing stones, and there were daily battles. That's why I was sent there. And it was only once we began actually to understand that here were two different visions or two different perceptions of the same space. We as humanitarian providers looking into standards, the famous sphere standards, and we were satisfied that we had done our job in keeping people alive and better than elsewhere, because we have more money than in other situations. And on the other hand, you had people who were trying to create a living space, who were trying to go on with their lives, to regain what you're losing during this placement, which is your dignity, which is your identity. You're becoming a number, you're becoming persons of concern, refugees, whatever label is put on you, and that is where you lose some form of humanity. And so they were struggling very hard and really fighting for their requirement to, as a human being, to recover that identity. And that identity goes through individuality. And that's also where I have a problem with the term community, because we keep on considering, because you're from Syria and because you're from Dara, you are a community. You're not, you're individuals. There were, when I came there, 100,000 individuals, family units, 14,000 family units, with different requirements and different desires. And only once they were satisfied, people could actually think about the neighbor. And so understanding that, and I'm beginning to transform the space into a more living space, listening, and actually having people participate in a more constructive way in the design of what would take place. That was the beginning of change. It took us 1 year to basically bring peace back to the camp, or bring peace to the camp, which was based on that recognition that there were 14,000 families, 100,000 individuals, and they wanted different decoration, they wanted to eat different things, they wanted to express their humanity through difference, and then only finding again together. So let me also talk, and that's now broadening this up, about the broader context of what means people on the move and how we should look at it. And I think we have, unfortunately, or fortunately in a way, listened very much to the sort of appeals for the last 75 years to respect the Refugee Convention and sort of consider the rights of refugees. But we're forgetting that, okay, refugees is forced displacement, and internally displaced people as well, forced displacement due to conflict, persecution, bad things happening to people, but that in the same time, we're sort of elevating them above other human beings. And I think this is not right. And we are having here now a tendency in Italy, I mean, perceiving everybody else who is not a true refugee as a bad person. And
Yes.
I think this is super dangerous, and I think we have to put that into perspective. Yes, there are today, and I think the latest figure is 29 million people with a refugee status or something similar, or being stateless, and about 60 million or so internally displaced people. But it doesn't reflect the fact that there are hundreds of millions actually in search of them, and you can call it like this, the basic human rights. And we are forgetting that human rights mean as well the right to work, the right to leisure, the right to education, the right to many, many aspects which are not a reason to become a refugee, but are a reason to change place and look there for, in fact, realizing what you should be enjoying as a human being on this globe, which is a decent life. And so we are making that unfortunate difference between human beings. We're categorizing people into the bad migrants and the good refugees. In a way, I mean, certainly there are some people who consider that refugees are bad too, but in general, that's sort of the reaction you have. The other danger we're having is that sort of you hear the word refugee, you think immediately tent, UNHCR, camp. And that, again, reflects only a minority of the people who are out there somewhere, initially running for their lives and then trying to build up a new life. The reality is there are dispersed amongst the local population somewhere, and particularly in urban spaces. So they're becoming part of a larger urban fabric, or in villages as well, of course, but to a large extent into coming and moving into cities. So you're having in fact, only a very small portion of refugees in camps, of internally displaced people in camps. And we keep on thinking only about the camps. So we don't put that into this whole broader context of people on the move who, again, regardless of what their status is, are seeking basically a decent life as a human being. And so we should be looking much more into what is it, in fact, what represents that decent life. And here, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. So we're seeing a massive transformation of populations, of the, let's say, demographic fabric on Earth taking place. We have 1 million people or so moving into a city somewhere in the world every week. From 50% of our world's population, we will grow to in urban centers. We will grow to 75% in urban centers within the next 30 years or so. That means there's more than 3 billion people more moving into cities. And who are these people? These are people who, in that world, which is increasingly digitized, access to information and mobile, actually are getting, and there's mostly those people who have very little means. And so we are having an exponential growth of informal settlements, of cities growing into monsters instead of growing into accelerators of change. And a city, when it is well managed or relatively well managed, is an accelerator for change. The same as we have experienced in Europe in the last sort of 200 years or so, with a massive transformation, movements of the rural populations into the cities that enhanced better education, better health, and so on. And has actually led to what we consider today as being the success, if you want, of development. Not forgetting that not long ago, Germans, Italians, and Irish and others migrated en masse because the living conditions were poor and they were hungry. Again, meant most of them to the cities, but others abroad, in the United States and elsewhere. So migration, in that sense, and I think it has to be said once more, migration is part of our history. It is part of our future, must be our future. So the whole, idea that migration is something which needs to be stopped. I had many discussions and advising politicians who constantly talked about stopping migration. No, don't stop migration. Migration equals evolution. We exist, all of you, we exist because there has been migration. Now, unfortunately, again, most of the migration we have seen in our history of human mankind has been forced migration, unhappy migration. However, again, that was the reality. And maybe also to refer to that, before we invented our the Refugee Convention and we tried to then categorize people, well, there have been movements, they moved into cities, they were becoming part of growing population centers. There happened to be then first some form of a camp in the outskirts where these newcomers who had been pushed out by somebody else were arriving, seeking protection, shelter, and opportunities. And then increasingly were growing into these cities where they had arrived. And we talked about Beirut. I mean, the main Armenian quarters in Beirut. I mean, that were refugees coming in a while ago. So our cities, in fact, I say this quite often, are de facto refugee camps, which have transformed, which have urbanized, which have changed into something new. There is also an element which transpires in all our discourse on displacement, and particularly again about refugees. A good refugee is a returning refugee. It's somebody who, and that's part of the protection framework and the durable solutions framework. A good refugee is someone who will return voluntarily, well-informed, to his place of origin. That is sort of what we all have in our minds. The second solution, which we will find in all the handbooks, is resettlement to a third country if there's a particular protection issue and it's very unlikely they'll return. And only the third solution is local integration in the chain of value in durable solutions. Excuse me. So what is that does actually mean, and this is what I'm arguing very strongly more and more that I look at this and talking to people. The moment that you get out of your, let's say, usual habitat, which again is already a result of forced migration or migration and people's movement and tribal movements and God knows what in history, you're getting out of your setting, you're moving somewhere else. At that very moment, already transformation is taking place with a human being. That's where a human being starts to change, sees new things. I have been working in Kenya, let's say, with, I worked, the first camp I was establishing in my career was the Kakuma refugee camp, which has today 200,000 refugees from several nations, primarily from South Sudan in northwestern Kenya, but I was also involved in the Somali camps at the Somali border. There's people coming from little villages, very small villages, they had, talking about the Somalis, a few camels and a few goats, and then suddenly coming into a setting of 100,000 people. And then you're expecting that after an experience of 20 years or 30 years or whatever they would be staying, they will be returning to exactly the same place where they have been displaced from. Well, it's a myth. They will be talking about this, they will be emotionally attached to it, but in reality, they will not return to the place of origin. In reality, they will be returning to Kismayo, to Mogadishu, Badere, or Baidoa. And so is the experience we have jumping to another area in the world, another region, in Afghanistan, where millions of people returned to Afghanistan. And I was myself involved in the repatriation of roughly 1 million Afghans from Pakistan in 2000, from 2007 to 2011. Most people didn't return to the villages. They were disconnected from that. They had urbanized, they had changed. And of course, what happened then in Afghanistan is an incredible growth of the cities. If you look into the study, into the statistics, but there were no urban plans, no urban development plans made, because everybody was convinced, the whole humanitarian community was convinced they would be going back to the villages. Land allocation schemes, a little hut, a few goats, and so on, be happy. No, that's not the reality. It despises the right of people to be human beings. So we're basically doing as if, when we talk about migrants, refugees, and others, while they're somewhere else, nothing happens. They're exactly the same people, and then you put them back. And particularly for refugee camps, they have been stored in a refugee camp for 20 years. Then they're dusted a bit, and then they're going back to the same place, and there's the same people, and they'll be happy the same way. So we really need to respect that we have to deal with human beings, and a lot of human beings out there who really don't want anything else but a decent life. And in the end, that can also be somewhere else. And again, in our history, it has been like this. So allowing people to settle, to integrate, to become part of the social and economic fabric is in the end a benefit to all of us. Why again? Because it's also linked to demand and supply in a way. And now jumping over to Tunisia, where I'm based, we are now implementing a program on migration. One of them deals with the irregular migration, which has been increasing over the last couple of years from Tunisia tremendously into Italy. 16,000 or so recorded arrivals in Italy last year from Tunisia and of Tunisians, plus sub-Saharan Africans crossing the Mediterranean as well. Well, again, here we have to deal with basically the overspill of conditions in home areas where people don't see anymore of how they can have ends meet. They will move initially, will be seeking to move to a city, and that's why we also need to recall that when we talk about the African migration dimension, that most migration in Africa is happening within Africa. We have a lot of growth in some more successful, let's say, economic hubs, South Africa and so on. A lot of people moving there from all over Africa. And then some are making it in direction of Europe. Why again Europe? Because everybody, despite the danger of the crossing, and despite the fact that they know very well that there will be abuse, there will be sexually abused, there will be exploited as quasi-slaves. When you talk about some of the labor conditions on the other side, that they will be eventually expelled and being sent back, and so on. They still see that there is a demand on the other side. There's demand because we have, as Europeans speaking, we have a demand on labor force of all sorts. So that creates attraction. It's a pull factor. You have a push factor, you have a pull factor, and instead of, and that's of course a discussion which in Europe is very difficult these days due to populist party politics. We do have a very high demand, not only on highly qualified and skilled laborers, but also on low wage and so on laborers. So what should be done is, of course, to instead of again stopping migration, stopping and closing the routes in a way, we should be opening them, but in a legal way. And that has been, I think, one of the biggest disasters of European politics. Excuse me, I'm talking about politics, is not to open those legal pathways sufficiently. Now, to conclude here in terms of what I'm observing as being right now one of the biggest issues as well is, so we have hundreds of millions of people somewhere moving, ending up in informal settlements, trying to move from A to B, not being enabled to do so legally, so getting into a spiral, into a logic of irregularity, some into criminality, some into all forms of abuse. So you have a lot of people out there who need and require individual attention. And this is what we're seeing here. That's what we're doing here. What my company, Switxboard, is doing here in Tunisia, is to basically build up a countrywide referral system where we know exactly where the social service providers are, what they can and cannot do, being able to go to and talk to the individuals and tailor basically the response and the services to the individual rather than to a whole group, or basically trying to be as standardized as possible. No, we don't want to standardize, we need to individualize. Because if you don't do this, we're having increasingly, a high level of people who are completely lost in space, people who are losing their identity, can't recover it. And in the end, for us as society, as global community, that is, of course, a very, very negative and very dangerous development if we have more and more people who basically don't care about community anymore because the community doesn't care about them. So that is very important. And maybe a little remark as well for those who are interested in approaches. We have been developing in what we call the Sustainable Development Zone Alliance, a new approach of dealing with informality in urban settings. I just refer here to that, so have a look at sdzalliance.org, where we describe the way of how we could, through special jurisdiction zones, address from the bottom-up governance approach, how we could address informality in peri-urban and rapidly growing urban areas, ensure the access of those people who are, again, lost in space for the moment, the access to bankability, the access to established formal businesses, become part of, let's say, a more formal economy and society. So we are developing this. We have been working, or we are working, and it looks pretty promising in Ethiopia currently on how to respond to this rapid urbanization of particularly, let's say, unskilled rural migrants mixed with refugees, mixed with internally displaced people, which gives that usual urban sort of profile, which is currently emerging in many cities in the so-called global south. Thank you.
Thank you, Kilian. I think you addressed this topic from many different perspectives, and also it is important that we understand migration as part of a very complex urban transformation, which you mentioned. Urbanization is one of the most significant challenges that many cities are facing, and so migration is strongly intertwined also with the urbanization issues and the complexity that is also part of urbanization, especially for most vulnerable communities like migrants and refugees that could be actually find themselves in very difficult conditions in this complex situation that is also dealing with misconceptions, misunderstandings, preconceptions regarding the positions of humans, refugees and migrants, and not recognizing them as human beings just in search for an opportunity. I think we could bring back Husam and Wael in the conversation, since they were also addressing these topics when they were presenting, so that we can close this session, which is now almost 2 hours, that we have been through this conversation. But I think it was really informative, discussing this topic, migration, refugees, and displaced communities from so many different perspectives, highlighting, as we wanted to, the human condition. So, Husam, I think Kilian was somehow disagreement with what you
maybe I was misunderstood. It wasn't, I agree, it wasn't the Jordanian government per se. It was the top-down from United Nations and Kilian. However, there is another camp in Jordan. Jordanian government didn't allow such a transformation. That's my message was.
Yeah,
the transformation only was allowed in Al-Zatari and not in the other one, in Al-Zarqa. And that's to me still a mystery. Why they allow it in a way or another, allow it to happen at least.
No, they didn't allow Husam, they did not allow it in Zatari to happen. The people took the power. It was the Syrians who enforced. There was no choice because they were beating hell out of the Jordanian police. I mean, a police officer was killed and so on. I mean, it was not a funny period. Yeah. And then basically what happened was in a common agreement between UNHCR and the government of Jordan, they said we shall not repeat the same mistakes as in Al-Zatari, in Al-Zaraq camp. We shall keep them under control from day one. And so houses which you cannot move, toilets which you cannot steal, no open market. I mean, basically everything what created, in fact, real life in the end in Zatari, which today is seen as a success story, which at the time was seen as a failure. They wanted to prevent in the second camp, which has become really, in my opinion, a detention camp rather than a free, space where people can evolve and move forward.
Actually, you explain it quite well now to me. So no brainer why Al-Zarqa hasn't evolved then. So thank you. That's a new information for me.
Yeah,
because Al-Zarqa so far is still just, how can I say, a very rigid caravan structure.
Yeah, and they were cemented into the ground in order to make sure that they wouldn't be moved because the more sort of organic growth. The difficulty in Zatari was to explain to people that you need some form of spatial planning, that if you dig your toilet pit because you have stolen the public toilet materials, that if you dig the toilet pit in the middle of the road, that the water trucks cannot pass, and then they tell you, I dig the pit where I want, I'm a free man now, because I'm not under Bashar Assad anymore, so I dig the pit where I want. No, but you're affecting the other people. Yeah, but I don't care about the other people, but I want water and I want my private toilet. So that logic only, as I said before, that changed when people started to realize that, freedom doesn't mean exactly also cutting the freedom from the community or not respecting that their communal needs, and that is also again spatial management. So that's where spatial planning, where also my friends from the city of Amsterdam, who we had called in for help, to help with the city development and the urban dimension of Al-Zatari camp, they were becoming desperate because they were telling them, no, I don't care about the public space. It's me and myself first. And that only evolved over time. And that's why I'm saying what we need to work on is building up strength of a community and respect for community and society de facto through a respect for the individual. Because an individual who is despised by society, all what he has in mind is me and myself. And that's what we're having now with Waer, which we're basically nurturing and growing with the way of how we deal with the bad migrants is actually happening. We're helping people who totally despise society. They hate society because the society is only repressive. It's expressed through repressive Frontex border guards and whatnot. It's expressed through being people not being assisted in any way. So what is their trust in humanity? Zero.
Luisa, can I just would like to echo what Kilian said? At least from European perspective, when it's come to the refugees itself, one thing I really very much I appreciate the German approach to the refugees, those who enter Germany. They really look at them as an opportunity rather than a crisis. So that's, to me, is a very different mindset when you compare it with the Greek, when you compare it with Italy. By the way, even Syrian refugees in Turkey, not all of them are refugees anymore now. They are part of the society. They are part of the economy. But you have to invest on them. There is something, what I call it, capacity building. So some people are expecting them to be integrated within 2 or 3 months. No, it will take time. In Germany, they realize it might take 5 to 10 years to integrate them.
Yeah, but Husam, there also, I mean, again, that's politics. But I mean, the message to the newcomers was, dear friends, you're welcome. Be our guests, until you go home and rebuild your country. Wrong message, all wrong. What you have to say, now we're all here, and this is living together, working together, and we're forming, we'll make sure that this is going well. Of course, nobody prevents you from going home. That comes back to my narrative. And the chancellor in Germany, she said the wrong thing. She said, you will go home. So it's basically telling people, don't bother about learning the language, don't bother about integrating. It was telling the rest of Germany, now we will have to feed these guys until they go home. So
they will never go home, by the way. That's the things. And just I want to say, context is very key in this case. This is why I know the situation is very bad in Lebanon, but we need to appreciate it's not because Lebanese people want to be bad on Syrian. Lebanon is poor country. It is very dense country, lack of resources. So, and 1 million versus 3 million, that's really a huge number. I want to say that.
Yeah, exactly, Husam. Like, as I mentioned, before the 2019 uprising, we were suffering from lack of access to basic services. So imagine now with the deteriorating situation in Lebanon, there's more pressure, less access. So it directly you will have conflict between the host and the refugee and migrant communities, because the host community between themselves, they have tension because there are a lot of pressure on the basic services. So we need to expect that. But I just need to say something about your presentation, Husam. It was amazing. Thank you so much. It was really touching to see how the communities were actually putting their caravans next to each other to remind them of their hometown. So they just want to feel at home. And I think it's our job to make them feel at home, because we might experience the same thing as them. So really, we should always let them feel at home. This is what I loved about your presentation, really. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this round of comments at the end of all your presentations. I think it was clear that we had an amazing panel discussing the human dimension of migrants and refugees. And for our audience, I would just like to share from the screen here about the films that actually you can watch here that are talking about migrants, refugees, and displaced communities. These are films out of competition. As I said at the beginning of the session, we have Torn by Alessandro Gassmann, but we also have these 3 other films that are discussing migration as an emergency, of course, as a humanitarian emergency, but also it is talking about all the efforts from different institutions, humanitarian bodies, and also citizens to support those people, living in danger, crossing the sea and risking everything to look for a decent life and some opportunities for them, for their families, for their kids, because there are many children actually crossing the sea and trying to look for a better life in Europe, starting from landing in Italy. Of course, as I said, we are mostly in Italy into this Mediterranean crisis, even if migration is a global issue, as Kilian was mentioning. And so it is important that we expand our perspective regarding migration, also to better understand what it means and what is the condition of these people living during this long process of migration funding, looking for some stable place to call home. And there is also another special event I want to highlight here that also Husam was mentioning, the artist Margherita Moscardini that worked on this project, The Fountains of Zatari. She will be with us tomorrow for a special event, together with Sara Piccinini, the director of Collezione Maramotti in Reggio Emilia in Italy. She will present this project that she developed while being in the Zatari camp, mapping all the fountains in the camp that then became an exhibition at Collezione Maramotti, and also a work of art, a sculpture in the main park in Reggio Emilia, and now there is also a book, and the project is expanding in some other outcomes. It is important for me as a curator of this festival that we had the opportunity to actually have you in this opening session related to migrants, refugees, and displaced communities. So thank you again for joining. I see from the comments also that our audience appreciated a lot your presentations and perspectives. And so, since we will have the second edition of the festival in the fall this year, and we will continue discuss about migrants, refugees, and displaced communities, I hope there will be a chance that we meet in person in Bologna in the fall. I would be glad to host you here. And also to have the chance to make a small exhibition regarding all these amazing projects that you are developing, coordinating, and passionately also supporting as human beings yourselves. So thank you for joining. Again.
Thank you so much, Luisa, and hopefully see you in Bologna soon.
Thank you, Luisa. Good to see you, Kilian. Good to see you, Wael.
Yeah.
Good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luisa. Take care. Bye-bye.